New section content. How Toys R Us went from the world's biggest toy store to bankrupt Toys R Us wasn't killed by Amazon. It was killed by a $6.6 billion debt bomb planted by Wall Street, 13 years before anyone noticed. And that's what makes this story so fascinating. Because by the time Toys R Us filed for bankruptcy in 2017, most people thought they already knew what happened. Amazon won. Toys R Us lost. Simple. Except that's not actually true. The real story begins more than a decade earlier with a financial deal that quietly turned one of the most successful retailers in the world into a ticking time bomb. And once that clock started ticking, there was almost no way to stop it. We're going to break this story down into 4 parts. First, how Toys R Us became the most powerful toy retailer in the world. Second, the Wall Street deal that secretly doomed everything. Third, how Amazon delivered the final blow. And fourth, the collapse, liquidation, and the business lesson hiding underneath it all. Let's get into it. To understand how shocking the collapse was, you first need to understand just how dominant Toys R Us actually was. The story begins in 1948. A World War II veteran named Charles Lazarus opened a small baby furniture store in Washington, D.C. At first, he sold cribs, high chairs, and other products for new parents. But Lazarus noticed something interesting. Customers who bought furniture eventually came back looking for toys. Then they came back again. And again. The furniture sale happened once. The toy sales never stopped. So Lazarus made a decision that would completely change the direction of the business. He went all in on toys. It sounds obvious today, but at the time it was revolutionary. Most toy sales happened inside department stores. Toys were treated like a seasonal side business, a few aisles, a small section. Nothing special. Lazarus saw an opportunity nobody else saw. What if an entire store was dedicated exclusively to toys? Not hundreds of toys, thousands. That idea became Toys R Us, and it worked. By the 1960s and 1970s, Toys R Us was expanding rapidly across the United States. Its stores looked completely different from traditional retailers. Massive warehouse-style buildings, long aisles stretching in every direction, shelves stacked from floor to ceiling, every major toy brand under one roof. For parents, it was convenient. For kids, it was magical. Walking into a Toys R Us felt less like entering a store and more like entering a theme park. There was a reason Geoffrey the Giraffe became one of the most recognizable mascots in America. The brand wasn't just selling products, it was selling excitement. And that excitement translated into massive growth. By the 1980s and 1990s, Toys R Us had become the undisputed king of toy retail. The company expanded internationally. Revenue exploded. Store counts climbed into the thousands. At its peak, Toys R Us controlled an enormous share of the toy market. Manufacturers depended on Toys R Us shelf space. If you were launching a new toy, getting placement inside Toys R Us could determine whether your product succeeded or failed. The company had become so dominant that it seemed untouchable. But underneath the surface, a new threat was emerging. And surprisingly, it wasn't Amazon. Not yet. The beginning of the end would come from Wall Street. In 2005, Toys R Us was still a huge company. It wasn't perfect. Growth had slowed. Competition was increasing, but it remained one of the most recognizable retailers in the world. Then came the deal. A consortium led by Bain Capital, KKR, and Vornado Realty Trust acquired Toys R Us in a leveraged buyout worth approximately $6 billion. At the time, it sounded like good news. Private equity firms often promised they could improve businesses and unlock hidden value. Investors celebrated. Executives talked about future opportunities. But hidden inside the transaction was a problem that would haunt the company for the next 13 years. The debt. Now, if you've never heard of a leveraged buyout, here's the simplest explanation. Imagine buying a house using someone else's credit card, then handing them the bill. That's essentially what happened. The buyers borrowed massive amounts of money, used Toys R Us assets as collateral, and then placed that debt onto Toys R Us itself. Suddenly, the company was carrying billions of dollars in obligations, and those obligations came with enormous interest payments. Every year, hundreds of millions of dollars were leaving the company simply to service debt. Think about what that means. Every dollar spent on interest is a dollar that can't be invested elsewhere. Store renovations? Delayed. Technology upgrades? Delayed. E-commerce development? Delayed. Customer experience improvements? Delayed. The company wasn't standing still because management didn't care. The company was standing still because it couldn't afford to move. And this couldn't have happened at a worse time. Because retail was about to undergo the biggest transformation in its history, the internet. While competitors invested heavily in digital infrastructure, Toys R Us was trapped. Its balance sheet had become a financial prison, and Wall Street wasn't feeling the pain. Toys R Us was. The debt kept growing, the stores kept aging, and the gap between Toys R Us and its competitors grew wider every year. Then Amazon entered the picture. Ironically, Toys R Us saw the internet coming. In fact, they tried to adapt earlier than many people realize. Back in 2000, Toys R Us partnered with Amazon. The agreement was simple. Amazon would handle the technology. Toys R Us would become the exclusive toy seller on the platform. At the time, it looked brilliant. Amazon was still growing, e-commerce was still relatively new, and Toys R Us would gain immediate online reach without spending billions building its own infrastructure. But the partnership quickly fell apart. Amazon eventually allowed competing toy sellers onto the platform. Toys R Us argued that this violated the agreement. The dispute ended up in court, and Toys R Us ultimately won. But winning the lawsuit didn't solve the real problem. By then, consumer behavior had already changed. Parents had discovered the convenience of buying toys online, and once that shift happened, there was no going back. Amazon kept improving. Its logistics improved. Its website improved. Its selection expanded. Meanwhile, Toys R Us was still carrying billions in debt. It simply didn't have the resources necessary to build a world-class online operation. And Amazon wasn't the only threat. Walmart and Target were becoming increasingly aggressive. Both companies expanded their toy departments. Both could offer competitive pricing, and neither was burdened by the same debt crisis. Toys R Us was now fighting 3 battles simultaneously: Amazon online, Walmart in stores, Target in stores, and all while dragging billions of dollars in debt behind it. It was a fight that became harder every year. Eventually, the pressure became too much. In September 2017, Toys R Us filed for bankruptcy protection. Management hoped the company could restructure. The plan was to reduce costs, reorganize operations, and survive. But there was one problem. The debt was still there, and it was simply too large. By 2018, the situation had become impossible. The company announced liquidation. Store after store began shutting down. Entire locations emptied their shelves. Clearance signs appeared everywhere. A retail icon was disappearing in real time. When the process was complete, roughly 736 stores had closed. More than 33,000 employees lost their jobs. A company that once dominated an industry had vanished. And for millions of people, the most emotional image came from Jeffrey the giraffe. The mascot that had symbolized childhood for decades suddenly became a symbol of the end. an ending that many people still blame on Amazon. But that explanation misses the bigger picture. The lesson of Toys R Us isn't really about toys, and it isn't really about Amazon. It's about what happens when a company loses the ability to invest in its own future. Amazon didn't create the problem. Amazon exposed it. The debt created in 2005 slowly drained the company's flexibility, innovation, and ability to adapt. By the time competition intensified, the company was already fighting with one hand tied behind its back. Toys R Us wasn't killed overnight. It was weakened year after year until the final blow finally arrived. The $6.6 billion debt bomb planted in 2005 didn't explode immediately. It exploded exactly 13 years later. Right on schedule. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe to Brand Autopsy. Every week, we uncover the real stories behind the biggest business successes, failures, and collapses in history. And trust me, the next one is just as unbelievable.